Hi, my name is Lily Knight, and for my MWA 3, I'm going to be doing a podcast about linguistic identity. I first want to define linguistic identity in my own words. So, after doing some research and listening to the podcast and reading the different articles we had, I came up with a definition that linguistic identity is the way a language is used among groups that connects people by common understanding and beliefs, which are demonstrated through words or phrases that are used and understood by that particular group. I think that the way people use language can make them feel like they're a part of a group, and it allows people to connect to one another on a more personal level. I also found an article from the UNM database. The article was about the social and cultural aspects of linguistic identity. It focused a lot on the studies that have been done about the social aspect of linguistic identity. I liked the quote from the very first paragraph. It was talking about how different writers argue that, quote, language is the central means and medium by which we understand the world and construct culture. I think that this is pretty accurate with what we're talking about right now. Because, just like the TED Talk said, the way we use language can really tell people a lot about us. It can also group us into different categories, and it can make us feel more connected to people, and it can also make us feel more separated from people at the same time. The article that I found and the TED Talks that we watched helped me make my own definition for linguistic identity. So now that I've defined it from research that I've done, I would like to talk about my personal examples of linguistic identities and different discourse communities that I'm a part of that have different ways of using language. I think that there are a lot of different categories and subcategories having to do with language identity. I think the two main ones are formal versus informal language. So I'm going to talk about some of my formal and informal language identities. The first group I want to talk about is school. I do think that this can fit under both formal and informal. I think it just depends on who you're talking to. For example, if I'm talking to one of my professors or student teachers, I'm going to try to speak more formally. I'd try to speak more clearly and not use slang terms or bad language. I'd make sure to speak in a way that would be understood by both of us. And because I don't know my professors personally, I would try to speak more professionally so the language being used is clear to us both. I also think that when you attend a school, there are things that are understood between the staff and students that people who aren't part of the university might not be familiar with. Things such as online textbook programs or homework websites, or the UNM Learn system and the programs within Learn. I also want to talk about the students. I think for the most part, students would fall under the informal category of my linguistic identity. Me and my friends at school probably speak to each other more informally because we have common phrases and words that are understood between us. Some people might not understand the way that we communicate, which shows how linguistic identity can group people together and separate others. So the next discourse community of mine that I'm going to talk about is my work. Just like my school category, I think that my work can fall into both the informal and formal categories. Again, it depends on who I'm talking to. So if I'm talking to my boss or the owners of the restaurant I work for, I'm going to try to speak more formally and more professionally. However, if I'm talking to my friends at work, I'm going to speak more informally, and I'm going to be using words and phrases that we only understand. My school and work also overlap because I work with a lot of the people that I go to school with. So that's an example of how you can have groups overlap within your discourse communities. If I look at work as a whole, we all have understood phrases that help us work more efficiently. Some of these phrases are things that people who don't work at the restaurant probably won't understand. For example, when there's food that needs to be taken to a table and no servers are around to take it, our chefs will call out the word trails. This is a quicker and easier way to tell the employees that there is food that needs to be taken, and it helps us to work quickly and efficiently. The word trails was something that I didn't understand when I first started, and it confused me, and that shows how linguistic identity can make people feel excluded from a group. Another example for my work would be things like table numbers and sizes of tables. Like most restaurants, we have certain numbers for each table that you need to learn in order to quickly communicate with other employees. While most people would understand that we're talking about tables when saying the numbers, they probably don't know which tables we're talking about. This is another example of how language used can group people by common understanding, like I mentioned in my definition. The last discourse community from my personal life that I want to talk about is my family. I definitely speak differently with my close family members than I do with other groups that I'm a part of. My family members and I have inside jokes as well as phrases that have a specific meaning to us that other people don't understand. A funny example of something that only me and my family understand was a made-up language that my mom and aunt came up with when they were little. It's called Opengloppish, and it's similar to Pig Latin, except for that you put an OP in front of every vowel. It's surprisingly difficult to understand if you don't know what it is, and so that's just a funny example of some way that I communicate with my family that separates us from other people. Now that I've talked about my personal examples, I just want to touch on some of the questions that we were given. When asked which language group I think is closest to me, I would have to say my family, and right behind that would probably be my close friends. Those two groups are closest to me because they're the ones that I feel most comfortable speaking to, and I can speak freely without having to try to sound super formal when I'm talking to these people. The other question that I wanted to answer is about the weight that each language has in society. I think that each language identity used in everyone's discourse communities is equally important in society. I think the trick is just to know which language identity is appropriate to use in each setting. I think that it's just about being able to separate the language that you use within each group. If I were to talk to my boss the way that I talk to my close friends, that would probably come off as being unprofessional. So that's just a little example of why it's important to make sure to separate each group. To tie all of this back to the quote that I first mentioned from the article I read, each of the language identities that I've talked about all add to the ways that I see and understand the world around me, as well as different cultures within each of my discourse communities. So now for my reflection, I'm going to be talking about my progress towards a few of the student learning outcomes that we've been working towards this semester. I would say that outcome B was mainly achieved in this MWA because talking about the different language groups within our community, we're basically talking about discourse communities and how they can be big or small and how they can bring people together and separate them at the same time. I would say that I've been working towards outcome C this whole semester. Throughout all of the assignments we've done in this class, we've been working on taking multiple approaches to plan and research, as well as getting multiple types of feedback in order to help improve our compositions. And outcome G was another outcome that I've been improving on this whole semester. Especially when doing the second MWA, I was able to better my research skills by gaining better knowledge of how to navigate the UNM database. Overall, I feel like I've improved a lot during this semester. From this class specifically, I've gained many new skills that will help me throughout the rest of my education and even further on. So that's it from my podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'm just going to end with my citations page that is loading. Here we go. All right.